Wow. Hey, how you guys doing today? Thanks for tuning in once again. Today we're gonna basically learn a little bit more about the Timucuan chiefdom here and their relationship with one of the first colonial groups, which is the Huguenots. All right, we're gonna go over some information we've gone over before in case you're new to who the Huguenots are as well. We recently learned about Chief Saturana or Saturiwa of the Timucua, right? And how they represented him as a so-called Moor, right? In these little statue they had in this collection in Dresden, Germany. So we're gonna actually read a little bit more about him today as a person, who he dealt with and his relationship with the Huguenots, right? The French Huguenots. We're gonna get into this journal article. It says Entangled Borderlands, Europeans and Timucuans in 16th Century Florida by Jonathan DeCoster. This is from the Florida Historical Quarterly, volume 91, number 3, pages 375 to 400. All right, so we begin here. It says in February 1566, grisly news reached the Norman port cities of Dieppe and Le Havre. The French Huguenot colonists who had left those ports for Florida less than 2 years previously had been cruelly slaughtered by the Spaniards. All right, so we've gone over this in a previous video. This is the one right here. Very good video. We read how the Spaniards, so-called Spaniards, which are representing the so-called Catholic Empire, slaughtered many French Huguenots. I'm going to show you guys who the Huguenots are so you can understand why the Catholics did that and why they had war or beef, right? So these Spaniards slaughtered a lot of Huguenots in Fort Caroline. So that's what they're talking about here. So this is 2 years later, right? Where we continue the story. So 2 years later, an open letter to Francis King, purportedly written by the widows and orphans of the victims, was quickly published in an attempt to prod the crown into action. The blood of your poor subjects, thus treacherously split, cries out before God for vengeance. It exclaimed. When the crown seemed deaf to the public outcry, a private citizen, Dominique de Gourgues, felt driven to personally avenge his countrymen. All right, so we read this account how Dominique de Gourgues, went and literally did the same thing to the Spanish, right? They're probably going to talk about it today here, guys. An ongoing war with the Catholics and so-called Huguenots. And before we continue, I want to show you guys, if you're new, who the French Huguenots are, really. All right, so I'm in this book real quick. It's called History of the Conquest of Spain by the Arab Moors, with a sketch of the civilization which they achieved and imparted to Europe by Henry Copy. This is volume 2, and this is written in 1892. All right, so we go to page 445 of this book, guys, right? This page starts talking about Columbus. He has Moorish blood in him. And it says that his vessel was fitted out in that little port of Palos, which had lately been a Moorish port, okay? His sailors were, many of them, with Moorish blood in their veins. Many of them had Moorish blood in their veins, okay? It has been asserted that when the Moors were driven out, thousands took refuge in the south of France, all right? Who afterwards, we're going to go to the next page, page 446, afterwards, abhorring the Roman Catholic persecutions, they became known as the Huguenots, okay? Huguenots, all right? Huguenots. And that of these, many emigrated at a later date to South Carolina. So who's the Huguenots? It actually includes a lot of the Moors and Sephardic Jews who fled during the Inquisition, the Roman Catholic Inquisition on the Jews and the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. A lot of them ended up in southern France, guys, and they became known as the Huguenots. Do you guys understand? Now, the Huguenots are so-called Moors. I'm going to read one more source to you guys for further correlation here. Now, I just want to tell you guys I have many videos on the Huguenots. Make sure to catch up to my presentations. We've gone over this whole book right here. We read every chapter, so make sure to check out the previous videos if you haven't. This is the book Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America by Elizabeth Hirschman and Donald Yates. Now, in the introduction of this book, it tells you about the beginnings and developments of the Inquisition. It says, although the historical backdrop of these developments may be familiar, some salient events are worth repeating, beginning with pogroms in Barcelona, 1391, and increasingly a century later when Inquisition tribunals were established throughout Spain. Sephardic Jews made their way by the thousands to France, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, and Britain. Once denounced or exposed in their homeland, Jews were not allowed to immigrate to Spanish possessions in the New World, although many went there as new Christians or conversos, okay? They came in with this tag. Beginning in 1492, the Muslims of Spain and Portugal were likewise forced to accept conversion to Christianity or flee their homes. Unlike their Jewish counterparts, they were not explicitly forbidden to immigrate to New Spain. Their influence in the Americas is largely unstudied and certainly unappreciated, all right? So that's what we're studying today, all right? Huguenots is one of these groups, right, of Moors who got kicked out of Spain, ended up in France. They have a lot of history in colonial America, and they are in the genealogy of many so-called Americans. The death knell for them came in 1609 when several 100,000 Moriscos remaining in Spain and Portugal were declared undesirable subjects of the crowns and also summarily ordered into exile. They left in droves for non-Catholic lands, many settling as merchants. Who's the merchants? In England, all right? Who's the merchants? We've broken this down in previous videos. It was mainly the Sephardic Jews and the Muslim Moors. All right, so they're the merchants in England and Scotland. Although the bulk of the refugees fled to North Africa and Ottoman or Turkish lands, dodged a hijack, thousands of others sought safety in France and the Low Countries. As Protestantism swept across Western Europe, many of these Jewish conversos and Moriscos became often only outwardly Protestant, only in appearance, only, they said, yeah, I'm Protestant, only, but really, they were cryptos, they had converts, they were practicing their religion in secret. Swelling the ranks of dissenters, some even provided leaders for the Huguenots, all right? Huguenots, I told you guys. Another source telling you, Hussites, Anabaptists, the Calvinists, German Reformed, the Walloons, the Mennonites, the Dunkers, the Quakers, the Puritans, and Presbyterians. Yes, guys, Moors and Sephardic Jews. These are your so-called Protestants, mostly. Okay, we've gone over this in many videos with many sources, and we've shown the genealogy. Make sure to catch up, guys, if you're new. I'm going to go back to the article now that we know who the Huguenots are, so we can have a better perspective when we're talking about these Huguenots dealing with the Timucuan people. All right, so now you guys know the French Huguenot colonists, all right? They had been slaughtered by the Catholics. Now you know why, because, or the so-called Spanish, right? Or the Spaniards, because they were Moors or Sephardic Jews. They had war, they had beef. So now this guy, Dominique de Gorges, their hero, is going to come avenge them, all right? And guess who he's going to use for help, guys? It says here, an anonymous contemporary text titled The Recovery of Florida tells the story of how in 1568, Gorges convinced a small force of French soldiers and sailors to recapture Florida for France. The Recovery of Florida praises the zeal and fearlessness of Gorges, but it also recognizes the extent to which his success depended on the participation of indigenous allies. According to the narrative, Gorges knew that the French colonists had befriended some of the natives several years earlier, and he expected them to willingly augment his slim numbers against the Spaniards. As anticipated, when Gorges encountered Saturiwa, okay, Chief Saturiwa, there you go, guys. Chief Saturiwa, the leader of an alliance of Timucuan Indians. Saturiwa professed that he and his allies had never ceased to love the French, all right? They loved the French because of the good treatment they had received, all right? They loved their Huguenot, these Moorish brothers that they encountered, all right? The text celebrates how, after the French victory, Gorges was greeted as a liberator by the Timucuans. One old woman even proclaimed that she did not mind dying now that she had once more seen the French in Florida. In most contemporary and modern accounts of this event, the Timucuan allies of Saturiwa are seen to have eagerly joined Gorgies because of their long-standing friendship with the French and the maltreatment they had received from the Spanish, all right? A long-standing friendship they had with these so-called French because why? They didn't like the Catholics. Remember that the Spanish also included Moors and Sephardic Jews, so don't think Spanish are the evil ones, and it's just, in this case, they mean the Catholics, okay? Implicit to such an interpretation is the assumption that the conflict in Florida was simply a peripheral outgrowth of the rivalry between France and Spain, originating in Europe, all right, or between Protestantism and the Catholic Empire. While the events of the massacre and the reprisal undoubtedly serve as excellent illustrations of how European conflicts were played out on a smaller scale at the periphery of empires, a strict focus on the Franco-Spanish dimensions fails to take account of the indigenous people who participated in the conflict, okay? They always leave this part out. The Timucuans were not simply co-opted by the European rivalry, but instead willingly chose to take part in the Franco-Spanish dispute because of its utility for their indigenous political interests, all right? So again, remember, when they're saying Franco or French versus Spanish, they mean Protestants versus the Catholics. In this case, the Protestants are mainly French. That's why they're calling them French, and the Spanish in this case are the Catholics, right? So the Timucuans joined in the Protestant Catholic dispute. Emphasizing this native-oriented dimension allows us to see how the European experience in Florida was shaped not only by intra-European conflicts, but also by intra-Timucuan conflicts, all right? There was local warfare here too. So Chief Satirigua, he had a plan too, guys. Yeah, he had enemies too, or people he wanted to get rid of. So all these conflicts are playing out, as it says here, in part through European auxiliaries. Such an inversion requires recasting the concept of a borderland as not just a peripheral zone separating European empires, but also indigenous polities. In the 16th century, most of Florida had indeed the North American continent remained under undisputed native hegemony. In those places, as Juliana Barr has put it, the primitive power relations were not European versus Indian, but relations among native peoples. Would-be colonists arrived on the continent to find themselves amid pre-existing rivalries and alliances that conditioned whether natives would choose not only to adapt or resist, but also to assist colonial incursions. All right, guys, remember, they took advantage of our beefs over here, our warfare, our tribal warfare. They took advantage of that when the colonists came. So some of us, aligned ourselves or allied ourselves with certain colonists, and other tribes aligned themselves with other colonists. And that's how it went, because we were trying to eliminate the competition everywhere possible, right? Warfare. Native leaders' choices had significant effects on European colonies, and we cannot understand them apart from their native political context. As representative examples of the relationships commonly formed at the leading edge of colonial empires, the ever-shifting alliances between Europeans and Timucuans in the 16th century helped illustrate how these complex and entangled interactions characterize imperial and native borderlands. The relationship between Saturigua and Gorgies emerged from a deeper and more ambivalent history between the French and their native neighbors. A year before the massacre, in 1564, the Huguenots had established a colony in an area inhabited by a dense population of natives labeled by scholars as Timucuans. Anthropological linguists define Timucuan as a distinct language family spoken across a broad swath of northern Florida and southeastern Georgia, all right? We're going to go over a great book that's going to break that down for us, guys. Not today, but in another video. We're going to get more in depth into these nations and the different clans, tribes associated with this Timucuan language, okay? It had about a dozen closely related dialects. Perhaps as many as 20,000 Timucuan speakers lived in this area in 1564. The societies were stratified into a hereditary nobility and a class of commoners, although commoners of exceptional ability could rise into the elite class. Europeans recorded the use of the terms Holata, Utina, and Paracusi to designate Timucuan chiefs, yet it is not clear whether these terms indicated hierarchical levels, local variation, or some other distinction for the Timucuans, such as a peace or war leader. These chiefs and important counselors inherited their offices matrilineally. All right, it was actually matrilineally first, huh? And while chiefs did not possess absolute authority, they were treated differentially and enjoyed privileges such as the right to collect tribute and the right to exemption from certain kinds of labor. Men usually filled these roles, though not exclusively. These characteristics have led anthropologists to characterize the Timucuan polities as simple chiefdoms, political entities with one level of hierarchical social institutions above the local community. The Timucuan chiefdoms emerged in the context of regional social change generated by the rise of Mississippian chiefdoms in the interior southeast around AD 1000, all right? Mississippian societies developed new levels of social stratification and political consolidation that supported the creation of monumental earthworks, the expansion of agriculture, and several other traits that scholars identify as markers of Mississippian culture. They had also began to maintain long-distance exchange networks. Mississippian culture traveled along those exchange networks from the core Mississippian area in the Mid-South to the Atlantic coast. There, at the eastern terminus of such exchange, the Timucuans could be said to inhabit the periphery of the Mississippian world. Although smaller scaled and less complex than their Mississippian counterparts, Timucuan chiefdoms came to encompass between 2 and 10 villages, organized into ranked hierarchies, and temporary alliances could bring together as many as 40 chiefs under a single dominant leader, all right? 40 chiefs. So they had a king of kings, all right? Anthropologists and archaeologists estimate that 25 or 30 of these chiefdoms may have existed when Europeans arrived in Florida. But as with other Mississippian and Mississippian-like cultures, the growth of chiefdoms displaced populations and increased competition for resources, leading in turn to a rise in intersocietal conflict. So beef amongst themselves, you see, amongst even their own tribal people, amongst chiefs. In fact, the name Timucua itself evolved from usage by Spanish colonists in the 16th century. It seems to have been a pejorative meaning enemy rather than a self-designation. The term Timucua gestures toward the diversity and competition among the Timucuan-speaking polities. These long-standing rivalries led the Timucuans to recruit the French newcomers as allies in their intra-native conflicts at nearly every opportunity. All right, so big one right there. The Timucua didn't call themselves Timucua. It seems like the Spanish were really meaning the enemies, right? But it was more again of a dialect. There was a group of people speaking this Timucuan language. We're gonna break that down again in another video. So basically, they was just trying to explain why they would ally themselves with Europeans. And yeah, you know, hey, the people have their reasons, right? And people got their competition and enemies, and they want to survive and help their tribe and their people, right? Was it always the right thing to do, though? That's a whole different question, guys. And I'm being real, you know, not to upset anybody that might be a descendant of the Timucuans, you know, nothing like that. The French colonists encountered 4 major mutually hostile Timucuan polities during the 14 months they spent in northern Florida. The French fort was near the mouth of the St. Johns River, where the colonists interacted most intensively with the Paracusi, Saturiwa, and his affiliates. The French were told that he ruled over 30 subordinate chiefs, which would have corresponded to a capacity to field several thousand men if necessary. All right, you guys hear that? So that's why I remember when they created that statue of Saturiwa, why it was decked out with gold and pearls, right? Because he was a king of kings. He had all these chiefs under him, right? Subordinate to him. Further up the St. John's, the Olata or Utina led a confederacy of some 40 village chiefs deeply antagonistic to Saturiwa's alliance. Okay, now listen to this. This is a whole other king of kings. Same people, right? They all speak Timucuan, Olata, or Utina. You guys can read up on these people, right? Less is known about the inland Potano chiefdom, all right? There's another chiefdom, the Potano, another king of kings, also speaking Timucuan language, all right? Very little they say is known, but we're going to break it down in other videos. But in the 1560s, it was considered nearly as powerful as Saturiwa and Utina, all right? So 3 powerful chiefdoms of the Timucuan-speaking people. It wasn't just Saturiwa that was there. When the French arrived in 1564, Utina was already actively at war with both Saturiwa and Potano, all right? So they had war amongst each other already. Finally, a pair of related chiefs, Ustaqua and Onateaqua, resided further to the west, beyond the normal range of interaction with Saturiwa, but regularly at odds with Utina. Ustaqua and Onateaqua may have been siblings, and each allegedly possessed a population as great as or greater than Saturiwa's or Utina's polities, all right? All these chiefs had great empires or chiefdoms. René Goulani de Landonnière, all right? Another Huguenot. We know about him. We read about him in my previous video. Make sure to check that one out, all right? This one right here, guys. It says here, the captain of the French settlement recognized that military assistance was perhaps the most valuable asset he could offer the Timucuans. He's like, hey guys, we'll give you guns, we'll back you up, we'll give you soldiers, all right, and you help us. He believed that he could exploit their animosity. He exploited the beef. You see what I'm saying, guys? They took advantage of the beefs we had over here. So he exploited their animosity to draw them into alliances. He drew them into an alliance, yet avoid alienating himself from their enemies by failing to actually commit to violence. By maintaining favorable relationships with mutually hostile Timucuan rivals, he did the same with the rest. You see that? He gave them all a deal. He hoped to retain the ability to trade for food, gather information, agent, and pass across Timucuan borders to sources of gold and silver rumored to lie inland. His meetings with Timucuans often focused on their rivalries. You see what he was doing? He was getting them to fight each other. He was making the situation worse because it benefited his plans. So he always focused on their rivalry. He's like, hey, don't you got beef with Ulatina? Why don't you go get rid of him? I'll help you. As it says here, giving him frequent opportunities to pledge French soldiers to serve native leaders, all right? French soldier, Huguenots, Moors, under what? Chiefs, all right? Who's leading them? Chiefs, American Indian chiefs leading Moors, helping them fight other chiefs in America. He concluded his first such alliance with Saturiwa around June 28th, 1564, when Saturiwa revealed that he considered Owatina his oldest and truest enemy. Quickly making the connection between his desires and Saturiwa's needs, Landonnière explained that I understood what he wanted to say. And to make him better love me, I promised to join him with all my power when he wanted to fight, something that pleased him greatly, all right? So you see this devil trying to make them war and saying, hey, don't worry, man. I got your back. I'll give you soldiers. Go ahead. Go to war with Utina. But to Saturiwa's disappointment, Landonnière delayed fulfilling his commitment. In fact, the French captain made covert contact with members of Utina's alliance. Do you hear that? So he was playing both sides, guys. He was playing both sides. In an effort to entice the French into helping him attack Utina, Saturiwa had told them that his rival's upriver location granted him access to the Appalachian Mountains, the source of the Timucuans' silver. But Saturiwa's ploy backfired. This information made Utina appear a more potentially valuable ally than the coastal Saturiwa. Upon making contact, Landonier's lieutenant promised one of Huetina's subordinates that one day the French would bring their forces to join him against Huastaqua and Onatequa. All right, so you see what he's doing? He's playing all sides right here. These Huguenots, right? These Huguenots. This is a Moor. This is a Huguenot. Don't think the white man. Now you guys say, oh, the white man came and put us to beef and separated us and did this to us. This is a French Huguenot we're talking about that is trying to put all these chiefdoms into war for his benefit. The French would eventually make contact with Huastaqua too and make a similar offer to join with him. All right. So they even did it with them, right? Like, hey guys, we got your back. Don't worry. We'll go fight the other guys for you. He was again doing it with all the chiefs he encountered there. All right, divide and conquer. That's what he was doing. This French Huguenot, so-called Moor. And he said, put all of the rest of the people under obedience to us. With each step further inland, Laudonnière offered to help the Timucuan leaders against all of their other rivals. Okay, you see what he's doing? Divide and conquer. This is what they did, guys. The strategy was a house of cards, effective only as long as the French captain could avoid committing to any one of the Timucuans and turning all others against him. Frustrated with the delay and possibly apprised of the meetings with Huetina, Saturiwa pressed Lanudir to, as the Frenchman understood it, carry out the promise that I had made when I had first landed in this country, to show myself a friend of his friends and an enemy of his enemies. Laudonnière responded by expressing a desire to avoid entanglement in these Timucuan rivalries. For his friendship, I did not want to gain the enmity of another. He told the disappointed Saturiwa. Laudonnière claimed the role of a disinterested peace broker, yet gaining the friendship of one Timucuan chief at the expense of another was precisely his strategy. All right, that's his plan. He offered that if Saturiwa could be reconciled with Huetina, they could both unite with the French against their common enemies, Huastaqua and Onatequa. Rather than alienate Saturiwa outright, he still tried to maintain a semblance of the alliance that he knew remained a potent bargaining chip with the Timucuan Paracusi. Laudonnière found this policy difficult to sustain. However, Saturiwa ostensibly agreed to the proposal of reconciliation with Huetina, but even Laudonnière could read the growing resentment behind the friendly facade, all right? So he was willing, I thought he said that was his most truest enemy. Now he's willing to reconcile just to team up with the French Huguenots? Why? So they can beat the other two chiefdoms? In September, Laudonnière dispatched his lieutenants, Michel Le Vasseur and Thibaut de Arlac, with 10 soldiers to Huetina's village to make peace between the rivals. The Timucuan Olata seems to have welcomed the arrival of French soldiers, and he requested they join him in an attack against his rival Otano. Huetina may have recognized the difficulty in turning the French against Saturiwa, or he may have been more interested in exerting his power into the interior than downriver into Saturiwa's coastal plain. For the French soldiers, residence at Fort Caroline had seemed an unjust imprisonment, calculated to rob them of the conquest for which they had come to Florida. Huetina had sent enough gifts to the fort to convince the soldiers that he could provide them with better access to the riches they sought than Saturiwa, and they grew restive under Laudonnière's restraint. All right, so you hear that? They're like over here fighting for the attention of these French Huguenots, so-called Moors. You know, hey, don't worry, I'll make you more rich. I'll make you more rich, trust me. And these French Huguenots love hearing that. Like Laudonnière, they too expected to manipulate native rivalries, but they favored a more active role. The Spaniards, they argued, when they made their gains, always allied with some king to ruin the other. For both Laudonnière and his men, the exploitation of native conflict was a key strategy. Okay, this is what they were doing, guys. They simply differed on their opinion of how much to commit themselves to a single Timucuan leader. Although Laudonnière had thus far avoided actual fighting on behalf of any Timucuans, in his absence, his lieutenant D'Arlac agreed to Uatina's request to provide 6 French arquebusiers for the attack on Potano. With the French firearms positioned at the front of Uatina's 200 warriors, the combined force easily took the town, with only 1 Frenchman killed during the fighting. The French captain had intended to avoid entanglement in the Timucuan rivalries, but now the French were finally engaged on behalf of Uatina, a commitment that increased the complexity of their relationships with other Timucuans. All right, so now they're all in because now they participated in murdering other, Indians and other tribes and taking over another chief. Continuing the article says here, over the winter of 1564, 1565, Uatina requested another strike against Potano. Entangled in an increasingly complicated web, Laudonnière hesitated, but fearing the unrest and dissension that already racked Fort Caroline, he submitted to the will of the soldiers. 30 Frenchmen joined 300 of Uatina's men for a second joint victory against Potano. Right? So-called Frenchmen. Don't forget, Huguenots, Moors. At first, this seemed to bode well for the ability of the French to replicate the kind of intercultural cooperation that had led directly to spectacular Spanish successes in other parts of the New World. But in fact, the Timucuan rivalries proved difficult to manage. In the aftermath of the victory, Uatina dispatched a squadron of messengers to loudly proclaim the victory among the Timucuans. This not only served to spread the word of Uatina's increased military might, but it also alienated the French from many Timucuans who considered themselves Uatina's rivals. Saturigua had already expressed a growing resentment of Laudonnière's inconstancy, and as word of the Franco-Uatina victory over Potano reached other adversaries of Uatina, many sent emissaries to Fort Caroline, hoping to turn Laudonnière against his new ally. But with these 2 strikes, Uatina had successfully supplanted his rivals. He had become the only military ally of the French, and the permanent presence of French soldiers now preemptively guarded his village from other Timucuans who would be reluctant to alienate the French colony. Wow, guys, wow. So now he got Moorish soldiers, right? We got Huguenots, right? French Huguenots, so-called Moors, guarding the village of Uatina. All right, they were working for him now. Saturigua and his cohort now refused to trade with the French. This left Uatina as practically their only trading partner, a development that introduced a dangerous sort of dependency for the French colony. Laudonnière had prudently traded for food throughout the fall and stored it for the difficult winter, anticipating the arrival of French supply ships in late spring. But when the ships failed to appear by May, Saturigua's rejection left Uatina as virtually their only source of food. Laudonnière had previously hoped to avoid this vulnerability by withholding his commitment to any single one of the Timucuans, but now the French were compelled to protect Uatina's village and its stored corn from retaliation by Potano. Oh, now they gotta protect the indigenous village, right? Their interests had become increasingly entangled to Laudonnière's chagrin. The French soldiers had hoped that their support for Uatina against Potano would stand them in good stead, but Uatina's Timucuans now began to exploit the French in their trading, demanding exorbitant rates on the rare occasions they agreed to trade at all. So you see what they did to the Moors now? Now they owe them big time. Now they got them in the palm of their hands. So before we continue, just want to show this image they got here. All right, it says, Theodore de Brie, how the king Uatina defeated his enemy Potano with the help of the French. All right, so that's why I say dodge the hijack with these whitewashing on both sides. Theodore de Brie was a third party. He didn't actually see any of these people. We found that out in my recent video on the statue of the Moor with the emerald clusters. Continuing, as Laudonnière himself grimly mused, thus one commonly sees that necessity changes men's affections. Furthermore, in the vulnerability of the French, Uatina saw an opportunity to further antagonize his Timucuan enemies. He communicated to Laudonnière that he wished to take prisoner a disobedient subordinate named Huastina, and he once again requested military assistance. The French would find food at Asina's village, he implied, which they could loot after the completion of their task. So we got one American Indian chief sending these Moorish French to go sack another village and bring somebody as a prisoner. Laudonnière agreed to provide the soldiers, but Wautinaz deployed them instead against other enemies. Laudonnière's account leaves unclear the means of Wautinaz's deception or the true target of the French soldiers, but there can be no doubt as to the rage and indignation felt by the French soldiers who had been deceived. Just still, Laudonnière feared to retaliate. As the colonists neared starvation, the French captain found himself on the wrong end of his own manipulations. You see, his plan backfired. Wautinaz had used his influence over the food supply to dominate the French trading negotiations and strong-arm them into fighting against their will. He had benefited immensely by welcoming European colonists into his territory, and he clearly remained focused on turning French guns against his native rivals. However, French acquiescence was about to end. Reluctantly, Laudonnière allowed the soldiers in Fort Caroline to persuade him to capture Wautinaz and ransom him for food. The French captain feared inciting the Timucuans further, but he feared his rebellious soldiers more. A French force successfully abducted Wautinaz in the late April of early May 1565, but the action failed to generate the hoped for delivery of food. Instead, Laudonnière recorded the development of a power struggle within Wautinaz's alliance that diminished French hopes of any ransom. Two factions now competed to name his replacement, and they appeared to show little concern for their former leader, although there is the possibility that this was a strategy in which Wautinaz was complicit. The French believed that the ransom negotiations served only to buy time until an opportunity should arise to capture Laudonnière or attack the French colony. And indeed, on July 27th, Wautinaz's Timucuans ambushed a French party, initiating a period of open warfare. Okay, now they got the war on them. The break with Wautinaz failed to accomplish its intended aim of securing food for the colonists, but it did open the door for a rapprochement with Saturíwa and his allies. Soon after Wautinaz's capture, Saturíwa's messengers began arriving at Fort Caroline, asking that the rival Olata be executed or released to them. In exchange, they offered as much food as the French might need. Laudonnière refused to surrender Wautinaz, but he and the other French colonists nonetheless took advantage of the opportunity to obtain food from several villages associated with Saturíwa. After the outbreak of a full-blown fighting with Wautinaz in late July, the reunion with Saturíwa seemed complete, and the newly reconciled allies filled the French boats with corn. All right, so now he's cool with Saturíwa. All right, Saturíwa's on his side now. It appeared then that Saturíwa had finally triumphed over Wautinaz. He had regained his position as a primary French ally and trading partner, and French soldiers were now finally willing to fight against his rivals. As helpful as the reconciliation with Saturíwa was for the French, though, they had learned that they could not safely depend on the Paracusi and his food to preserve the settlement, and they would still need reinforcements and supplies from France if they hoped to survive in the long term. With the French ships 4 months overdue, the colonists lost hope in such deliverance, and they readied their own makeshift boats for the retreat home. As Laudonnière prepared to depart, he regretted the rift with Wautinaz, but he argued that his reconciliation with Saturíwa ameliorated, perhaps even compensated for the failure. With little else to show for his 14 months in Florida, he held up the alliance with Saturíwa as a triumph, and indeed the primary objective of his enterprise, stating, "Yet I lost not the alliance of 8 neighboring kings and lords, who always succored me with everything that was possible. Indeed, this was the main point of all my designs, to win and hold them, knowing how much their friendship was important to our enterprise. In point of fact, they had not always kept him supplied with all that he needed. That was merely the tentative state of affairs as he planned his departure. Even then, Laudonnière promised that the French would help Saturíwa defeat his rival Timucuans, As he had vowed so many times before writing, I gave them to understand that within 10 moons, as they call their months, I would see them again with such force that I would render them victorious over all their enemies. For Satouriwa, this promise was encouraging, but he pressed for still more. Until their return, he requested that Laudonnière hand over one of the small boats and leave Fort Caroline intact for protection against Wotina and other rivals. To this, Laudonnière reluctantly agreed, hoping to remain on friendly terms until his departure. Both Laudonnière and Satouriwa tacitly understood that any cooperation between the French and the Timucuans was dependent on its utility for Satouriwa's rivalries with other Timucuans, and should that utility diminish, the friendship would be withdrawn. In a striking twist of fate, just as Laudonnière waited for favorable winds to carry the colonists back to France, on August 28, 1565, Jean Ribault's reinforcement fleet arrived. All right, Jean Ribault, we know about him too in previous videos. All right, more Huguenots. Ribault was followed promptly by Pedro Menendez de Aviles on September 4. Menendez was bent on destroying the colony whose inhabitants had so recently decided to abandon it. The violent encounter between French and Spanish colonists in Florida has been treated extensively elsewhere, but a cursory sketch will be helpful here, all right? So they're gonna break down some of the story we went over in previous video about the so-called rivalry between Spanish and French. It's really Protestants versus Catholics, all right? So again, Menendez was with the Catholics, all right? They didn't explain that. Menendez immediately challenged the French ships anchored outside the mouth of the River of May. Ribault opted to reload all his best soldiers and fight Menendez at sea, but a rising hurricane scattered the French fleet. Menendez managed to disembark his soldiers from 40 miles south of the fort, where he established the town of St. Augustine. And with the assistance of unnamed native guides, all right, with Indians helping him, other Indians, right, the so-called Catholics, right, helping the Catholics, took advantage of the hurricane to effect a surprise overland assault on the fort. The wounded soldiers and tradesmen left behind at the fort because they had been deemed useless for Ribault's fleet put up little resistance. The Spaniards easily took Fort Caroline. Within days, Indians reported to Menendez the wreck of the French ships scattered by the storm. Menendez sent soldiers to meet them, and the remaining French surrendered to the Spaniards in 3 groups on September 29, October 11, and November 1st. In the first 2 cases, nearly all the prisoners were put to the knife. All right, they were murdered, while in the third, Menendez took captive all who surrendered. The sources disagree about the precise numbers involved, but perhaps 200 to 300 French were executed. We're talking about Huguenots, Moors, executed by Catholics. Another 175 or so were captured. Some 50 escaped to the small French ships in the harbor at Fort Caroline, and as many as 220 voluntarily fled to the Timucuans. What? 220 what? They went to live, they went to what? Live and settle with the Timucuans. What? Moors. 220 Moors, Huguenots, preferring their chances with the Indians over the Spaniards. French and Spanish accounts of their clash accord little role to the Timucuans, but in fact, the Indians played key roles in shaping the encounter, and even their absences reveal conscious decisions about their participation in the European rivalry. Befitting the supposed alliance between the French and Satouriwa, the Paracusi subordinate ally Emolua kept Londoners informed on Spanish movements. He reported that the Spanish had seized the houses of the Timucuans at the village of Seloy, about 40 miles south of Fort Caroline, a description that implies at least some degree of resistance to the newcomers. In contrast, Spanish accounts record the gracious welcome they received at Seloy and the deep hostility to the French among the natives in its vicinity. So basically, whoever's writing the story is making themselves to be the good guy. It is unclear whether Seloy was considered part of Satouriwa's alliance, so the meaning of this discrepancy is ambiguous. If Seloy was ostensibly allied to Satouriwa and thus the French, the difference between the representations may indicate an effort by Satouriwa to court both the French and the Spanish, receiving the Spaniards kindly but giving the French the impression that they had been resisted. Indeed, the Spanish found 2 brothers at Seloy who were very familiar with Fort Caroline, having visited only 6 days prior, implying the presence of Seloy of at least Some Timucuans friendly to the French and Saturigua. The Seloy natives apprised Melendez of the potential size of the French forces and their relationship with various Timucuan leaders, and the two brothers familiar with Fort Caroline volunteered to lead the Spanish expedition as guides. It was also likely Seloy Indians who communicated the location of the French castaways to Menendez after his capture of the French fort. Unfortunately, the Spanish records provide little clarity of the Seloy natives' motivations, as the Spaniards had not yet learned to distinguish any of the native polities, referring to them generically as indios and individual leaders as caciques, without specific appellation. For the Seloy Indians, alliance with the Spaniards against Saturigua may have represented an opportunity to strike at an enemy or a tyrannical overlord. If they resented the treatment of the French specifically, they took a risk helping the Spanish, an unknown entity, supplant the French who had recently been brought under control by Saturigua. Without the guidance of Timucuans living south of Fort Caroline, the Spanish fleet could not have located the French settlement before Ribault, unload his reinforcements and supplies, nor could Menendez have orchestrated his surprise overland raid. But perhaps more significant is the complete absence of Saturigua and his allies from the conflict. The Timucuans in this area clearly understood that the Spaniards planned to attack the fort. So basically what they're letting you know here, guys, sorry to interrupt, is that they believe, is what they're hinting, is that they probably had something to do with this attack on the French too. They were helping the Spanish, Saturigua, right? They were playing both sides. He was playing both sides. So the Timucuans in this area clearly understood that the Spaniards planned to attack the fort, and Saturigua's ally, Aimoloa, obviously had access to news coming from Seloy. Yet Saturigua made no effort to assist the French against the Spaniards, okay? Furthermore, the Seloy's guides' familiarity with Fort Caroline, located in the heart of Saturigua's territory, might imply that they acted with his consent or under his direction. In either case, if Saturigua did not encourage the Spanish capture of the fort, he did not try to prevent it either. His alliance with the French apparently did not extend to protecting them from their European rivals, at least not until it became clear who was likely to prevail. The abrupt termination of the French colony has led to an oversimplification of its relationship with Saturigua. Saturigua, the French, and the Spaniards all perpetuated the fiction that Saturigua and his allies had never ceased to love the French, because it fit well into the narratives they each created to explain subsequent events. Modern historians have generally accepted this static interpretation, but the evidence indicates otherwise. The relationship had evolved over its first 14 months from a promising alliance through a period of tense hostility, and finally into a tepid agreement for Saturigua to provide food for the French to maintain their war against Hutina. Had the French remained, it doubtless would have continued to change. But because the relationship was cut off, the impression given in the autumn of 1565 became essentialized as an enduring friendship. Furthermore, the Spanish fear of retaliation bred a persistent belief in such an alliance, even in the face of contradictory evidence. All right, so he wasn't really friendly with any of them that much. Continuing, Menendez estimated that 150 French colonists had escaped him and found refuge with the Timucuans, all right? Remember, French Huguenots, Moors. And he believed that the ongoing potential of a combined Franco Saturigua or Moorish Saturigua retaliation posed a grave threat, all right? You guys hearing that? This is real history. And don't think French as the whole country. They're talking about Huguenots, specific type of French. Because of this, he immediately began negotiating with Timucuan leaders to have the French captives turned over to him. And he fretted constantly about the supposedly friendly relations between the French and the natives. This concern, however, was temporarily eclipsed by the need for provisions for his newfound colony. Menendez believed that the danger of the French alliances with Florida's natives would only be magnified if French reinforcements arrived. But he also recognized that starvation would compel his own soldiers to alienate the Timucuans. Of all the hazards of a new settlement, He considered a shortage of food the most pressing, and he left in November to procure supplies in Havana. All right, he went to Cuba. He prepared to depart. Menendez still held out hope that Saturiwa could be peeled away from the French. All right, so again, this Catholic doesn't mean he's so-called white just because he's fighting the Moors. These are Catholics versus Protestants or so-called crypto Jews or crypto Muslims. Okay, new Christians, conversos. And he's trying to ally himself with Saturiwa. He's like, yo, give me those French captives you got. Come on, man. So this is Menendez. He says, on this river, there are large settlements of Indians, and they all are great friends of the French that were there. But all the Indians do not have such perfect peace with them, and they cannot have a firmer one with us, because I will not allow a grain of maize to be taken from them, he reported to Philip II. Menendez reports to the crown missed few opportunities to laud his own singular abilities, and the ease which he expected to win native allies reveal some of the credulity to which he was sometimes given, particularly when Indians told him what he wanted to hear. But he had real reason to feel encouraged by what he had seen in his short encounter with the Timucuans. From September to November of 1565, the relationship between the Spaniards and Saturiwa's Timucuans was apparently intimate enough to encourage many of the Indians to relocate their dwellings closer to the former French fort, now renamed San Mateo, presumably for better access to European trade goods. Also, around September 20, Saturiwa turned over to Menendez several of the Frenchmen. All right, so he ended up giving them these Huguenots. And these guys don't really like the Huguenots, so what is he going to do to them? Who had sought refuge with him. So they were looking for refuge, and he turned them in to the Catholics, all right, to Menendez. That's what Saturiwa did, all right? All signs indicated that the Timucuan Paracusi's dedication to his French friends was less than absolute, despite Menendez persistently voiced fear of their close friendship and potential for combined retaliation. While Menendez wintered in Spain, however, the soldiers in Florida appeared to have undermined whatever goodwill had been earned. They repeatedly antagonized Saturiwa and his people, eventually killing 3 of his high-ranked allies. Relations had so deteriorated that when some of Saturiwa's Timucuans captured the Spaniard Rodrigo Troche in March of 1566, the Paracusi ordered his heart torn out of his living chest. All right? That's what they did to him. By May, Saturiwa had killed over 100 Spaniards and burned the fort at St. Augustine, all right? So he didn't like the Spaniards or the Catholics anymore because they were like acting up, all right? So this is a famous little historic battle, or really wasn't a battle, it was like a massacre actually, where the Timucuans, killed 100 Spaniards, they said over 100 in St. Augustine, Florida. The constant attacks forced the Spaniards to relocate St. Augustine to a more removed location at the entrance to the bar, a stark contrast with the Timucuans' own desire to live closer to the Spaniards at San Mateo only half a year before. Menendez, the frustrated commander, attributed the conflict largely to the unruliness of the common soldiers, who seemed to have lived a near constant state of rebellion. The chronic food shortages that plagued French and Spanish Florida in these years also suggest that demands for food likely played a central role in the soldiers' depredations. However, it may be significant that while Saturiwa made multiple overtures for an alliance during the autumn, Menendez neglected to follow up on the opportunity, preoccupied with exploring the rest of his newly won territory. He failed to make any contact with Saturiwa until late August 1566, a year after his arrival in Florida. At that point, he was rudely rebuffed by Saturiwa's subordinates without even meeting the Paracusi, who may have resented the failure of the Spanish governor to respond to his friendly gestures. Rejected by Saturiwa, within days Menendez found Ootina cautiously willing to accept an alliance with the Spaniards. All right, here comes troublemaker Ootina too. Thus, by the time Menendez finally met Saturiwa in person for the first time in March 1567, he had neglected the Paracusi for a full year and a half after settling in the heart of his territory. Saturiwa, surely had noticed that by then Menendez had already been allied with Huutina for 6 months. Regardless of whether Saturiwa's hostility stemmed from such a perceived insult, his first meeting with Menendez quickly soared. According to Gonzalo Solís de Meras, Menendez's brother-in-law, Saturiwa angrily revealed that though he had many times said to the captains of Menendez that he was his friend, he had not said this with a pure heart, because he held all the Christians for enemies, and that Menendez and his soldiers were hens and cowards. If true, this obviously had not prevented Saturiwa from seeking advantageous relationships with either the French or the Spaniards, but it helps explain his willingness to quickly abandon any intercultural alliance when it threatened to outlive its usefulness. And it undermines the characterization of the Franco Timucuan, or remember, Huguenot Timucuan alliance as an enduring friendship forged in united opposition to Spanish cruelty. Of course, it simplified matters for the Spaniards to characterize Saturiwa as duplicitous and inexorably antagonistic to Europeans, and we have only their account of this confession. But the fact remained that Saturiwa had not defended the French from the initial Spanish attack and had instead sought an alliance with Menendez. All right, so what the Spanish wrote about Saturiwa was not really correct, because he wasn't really allying with either of them, right? He was actually betraying the French sometimes too. We already read that. Far from being subsumed by the European conflict, Saturiwa dissimulated and chose opportune moments when participation on either side might serve his own ends. Menendez left for Spain on May 18, 1567, not long after his ill-fated attempt to reconcile with Saturiwa. In a meeting with Philip II on July 20th, he tried to marginalize his native problems, claiming that he had befriended all the leaders within 300 leagues of St. Augustine, with the sole exception of the Paracusi, Saturiwa. But contrary to his depiction, it appears that it was in fact Huutina who was isolated from other Timucuans, not Saturiwa. At nearly the same time that Menendez met with Philip, the Spanish chaplain Mendoza Grajales wrote a letter to the absent Menendez explaining that the Spanish garrisons had been forced to send 80 soldiers to protect Huutina from the united attacks of Saturiwa, Nocoroco, Potano, and others. All right, you guys hear that? The Catholics, all right, the Spanish defending with soldiers, right? Huutina against Saturiwa and other chiefs. They were trying to take over Huutina, all right? So you hear all this constant beef that's going on, people allying with certain others and coming together with other chiefs and then not coming together. So at times beefing, then at times coming together, and then at other times linking up with either the French or the Spanish. It all depended, right? Although brief, Mendoza Grajales' reference implies a unification of Timucuans who had not previously cooperated with one another and had in fact functioned as rivals. His vagueness only hints at the true extent of cooperation against the new Spanish-Huutina alliance, but clearly some kind of new opposition had coalesced. Without question, the Spanish colony provoked this disruption of pre-existent Timucuan political economy, and the Spanish force served as the targets of much of the aggression of Saturiwa and his new allies. But in the incident mentioned by Mendoza Grajales, many of the Timucuans targeted Huutina, not the Spaniards. Potano, who had been repeatedly attacked by the combined Huutina French forces in 1564 and 1565. I remember we read that earlier, when Huutina and the Huguenots, attacked Potano. Yeah. So he remembers that, right? So this Potano, right, he had little to gain from making enemies of the Spanish, but much to gain from the defeat of Huutina. As he saw himself harassed, he sent for help, and as a friend, we went it to him, wrote the chaplain, demonstrating how the Spaniards, under constant assault from Saturiwa, nonetheless felt compelled to dispatch a large force of soldiers to defend Huutina from Potano. Unwittingly, echoing La Donnere, Menendez had written of the Indians that I have not wanted to befriend any leader in order to make war with his enemy, even though he might also be my enemy. But this proved impossible in the Timucuan borderlands. Europeans invariably found themselves tangled in the web of political relationships tying the Timucuans together. While the Spaniards tried to navigate these political relationships, outrage steadily built in France over Menendez's actions in 1564. Remember, he slaughtered the Huguenots. One of the survivors, the carpenter Nicolas Le Chaloux, published a lurid description that proved particularly effective in galvanizing the public. His narrative held a special resonance for Dominique de Gourgues, a minor gentleman who had served the French crown for 20 years in Scotland, Piedmont, and the Levant. He had once been captured by the Spaniards and imprisoned as a galley slave, and this doubtless added to his spirited response to the news. He had previously made several voyages to Africa and South America, so he would not have attracted especial notice when he left Bordeaux on August 2nd, 1567, to make war on the Negroes in Benin. From Africa, he made his way to Cuba, where he surprised his soldiers and crew by revealing his ultimate aim to take revenge on the Spaniards in Florida. He needed to convince his men to take on the challenge, but he carried one of the former colonists with him as a guide and interpreter, proved that he had planned the scheme in advance. He reached Florida in mid-April 1568, just after Menendez departed Spain with a small relief fleet for the colony. The recovery of Florida, the anonymous French text sometimes attributed to Gourgues, himself emphasizes his cleverness in taking advantage of native allies to effect his revenge. When he, Gourgues, arrived in Florida, it reads, he surely associated with the savages and well understood how to make use of them and thus to make up for the scarcity of men he brought. The French commander fortuitously landed at the village of Takatakuru, an ally of Saturigua. Takatakuru enjoyed a particularly odious reputation among the Spaniards for allegedly slaying the Jesuit priest Pedro Martinez. And he stood accused of several other Spanish thefts. Before leaving for Spain, Menendez had left specific instructions that Takatakuru be hunted down and killed as a special targeted enemy of the Spaniards. Then, Takakuru presented Gourgues with an ideal accomplice for his avowed strategy of using the Indians to defeat the Spaniards. Gourgues fit equally well into the plans of Takatakuru and his Timucuan allies. The text records that Gourgues was greeted warmly as a liberator, first by Takatakuru, then by a hastily called assembly of Saturigua and his allies. According to the French text, Saturigua complained to Gourgues of ills they had suffered because of the friendship they had contracted with the French. Yet he assured Gourgues that they had never ceased to love the French because of the good treatment they had received from them when they commanded there. Indeed, the fear of the Huguenot-Timucuan alliance had kept the Spaniards on edge, but the actual interactions between the Spaniards and the Timucuans were more ambivalent than the Spaniards generally represented. Saturigua and Menendez had both demonstrated interest in an alliance that had failed to coalesce primarily because of Menendez's extended absences, not because the Huguenot-Saturigua alliance proved an inviolable bond, but the anonymous narrative, like the writings of the Spaniards, perpetuates the myth of an ongoing Huguenot-Saturigua relationship. But again, it wasn't always the case, is what they're trying to point out in this article. The register of the assembly taken by the French author conspicuously omits any mention of Potano or Nocoroco, Saturigua's allies as recorded by Mendoza Grajales, or any other Timucuan outside of the immediate vicinity of San Mateo. The broader coalition that had attacked Huatina the previous summer may have been too distant to assemble on short notice or simply uninterested in joining an assault on the Spanish fort. The latter is the more likely explanation because, contrary to the French text, Spanish sources record that Saturigua and Takatakuru did not await the appearance of the French for deliverance and had already assembled their forces before Gourgues' arrival. The Spaniards had suffered sporadic attacks by Saturigua and his allies for well over a year. According to one Spanish official, less than 2 weeks previously, 400 Indians had made a concerted assault on San Mateo. This ongoing conflict offers a more convincing explanation for their eagerness to attack the Spanish than any lingering loyalty to the French. "Have no fear," said the gathered allies of Saturíwa to Gorges. "We wish them more ill than you do." So they all want revenge against these Catholic Spanish, right? The combined forces of 400 Timucuans and 100 Huguenots, okay? This is a coalition of Moors and Timucuans, right? Going after the Catholics, right? They attacked San Mateo and two small block houses, routing their inhabitants and killing every Spaniard they laid hands on, all right? Again, we have a whole other version of this story, the actual primary source telling what they actually did and what they wrote, all the details in another video I made. Make sure to watch this after this one. I'll have it at the end of the video pop up so you can click on it. All right, very good video, and it's going to show you what they did. They didn't even talk about the Timucuans like this in that book. You know, they try to give credit only to Gorges, you know, and the Spanish and all this other stuff, right? They do mention allied, you know, Indian allies, but they don't really tell you 400 Timucuans and only 100 of them. All right, it was mainly Indians who won that battle. Okay, this is why I wanted to read this article, get another angle, a little bit more details, and we see how big was the part of the Timucuans and all this history with the French and Spanish there, okay? So they killed all the Spaniards. Remember that they were getting revenge because the Spaniards had done this in Fort Caroline to the French Huguenots before that. Remember? Menendez? While Utina was not directly involved in the Huguenot Saturiwa attack on San Mateo, there are hints that Spaniards' ongoing affiliation with Utina might have partly motivated Saturiwa and his allies to join with Gorges and the French soldiers. Upon receiving word of the assault, Esteban de las Alas, Estebanico, an official at St. Augustine, fled for help from Utina, indicating that their alliance was still quite intact. Unaware that the fort had already been lost, Las Alas asked Utina to send 6 men to deliver messages to the besieged Spaniards under the cover of darkness. Yet before Las Alas had even dispatched his request to Utina, a small contingent of panicked Spanish soldiers had already gone to Utina's village seeking refuge. Several years later, two Timucuan leaders tied to the Spaniards complained that their villages had been attacked by Saturiwa and his allies during the assault. This might imply that the assault on the fort offered an opportunity to settle intra-native conflicts, not directly related to hostilities against the Spaniards or friendship with the French, all right, or Huguenot. So all these people are just using each other. The Spanish and the French are using the native people, and the native people are using them too, all right? In the aftermath of the victory, Gorges had no intention of replanting a French colony in Florida. He chose not to challenge the other Spanish settlements at St. Augustine and Santa Elena either. Instead, after briefly revealing in his triumph, he joined Saturiwa's Timucuans in razing the fort and then departed. Surprisingly, despite Saturiwa's central role in the destruction of San Mateo, in the ensuing months, the Spaniards still entertained the prospects of reconciliation. Saturiwa's close ally, Emoloa, made overtures to them just 2 months after Gorges' visit, leading the Spaniards to believe that a turnabout for Saturiwa still might be possible. So they're still trying to, make friends with Saturiwa, even though he just killed, a bunch of them, right? In fact, the Spaniards may have pursued peace because Saturiwa no longer figured as the leader of their opposition. Rumors reached St. Augustine that Gorges had intended to build a permanent fort at the village of Taka Takuru, and by the end of 1568, that was where the Timucuans hostile to the Spanish presence gathered. The island on which Taka Takuru lived may have offered a more strategic site from which to mount a defense, or Taka Takuru's polity may have begun to eclipse Saturiwa's as the dominant power and the leader of the opposition in the region. A Spanish source from 1602 documents the preeminence of Taka Takuru, and the transition may have occurred earlier. When the Spaniards finally retaliated over the winter of 1568-1569, this was where they directed their efforts, implying that Saturiwa was no longer their primary concern. Hutina or his successor must have been pleased to see Saturigua's power wane. Even in the wake of the Huguenot Saturigua victory at San Mateo, in the long run, Hutina had reaped a greater benefit than his rival from his relationship with the European colonist. Gorges vowed to Saturigua that he would return within a year, but neither he nor any other French ships visited Florida for 8 years. Dozens of French sailors and soldiers shipwrecked in the aftermath of Fort Caroline's capture still lingered among the Indians, all right? Big one right there, okay? And the Indians' customs, a lot of times they take in people, they become part of the tribe. A lot of these so-called Moors, Sephardic Jews, cryptos, these colonists, these indentured servants, these auxiliary soldiers that got cast away here, they eventually became part of the tribes. And we're not talking about African runaway slaves, okay? This has nothing to do with that. We're talking about black Europeans, right? Who were the Huguenots, Moors who had fled the Inquisition and settled in the south of France, becoming known as Huguenots. And they were here getting cast away, left behind because of what they were experiencing here. And they would settle and eventually amalgamate, assimilate with the indigenous population, the Indians in Florida there and other parts of the southeast. But few were with the Timucuans any longer, having dispersed further north among the Timucuans' northerly neighbors, the Guale and Orista. Do you guys hear that? A lot of them had gone a little bit more north and actually settled with the Guale and Orista, who the Guale. Until 1578, it appeared that Spain's European rivals had abandoned their designs on Florida. In that year, a French ship foundered off the coast inhabited by the Guale and Orista. Okay, listen, around 100 French castaways were captured, and although the Native Americans enslaved them, the captives allegedly conspired with the Guale and Orista to contact the Timucuans and suggest a joint campaign against Spanish St. Augustine. The Guale and Orista had already destroyed the Spanish settlement nearest them. Remember that a lot of these French had already gone with the Guales, so a lot of these Guales, they're getting help by these French. They want revenge against the Spanish or the Catholics. So here they go, they're setting it up. So what's going on? The Guale and the Orista had already destroyed the Spanish settlements nearest them, Santa Elena. And if the allegation of an impending alliance with the Timucuans was true, were willing to overcome their own differences with the Timucuans to expel the Spaniards from their last major stronghold in Florida. But the Timucuans rejected them. The Indians here were not willing to consent to this, saying that they had peace and quietude with us and did not want any strife, wrote Pedro Menendez Marquez, now the governor of Florida. A similar event occurred in 1580 when two French ships tried to encourage another pan-Indian alliance centered in the territory of the Guale and extended into Timucuan lands. Rivalries between the Guale and the Timucuans worked against an alliance with the French, right? We're talking about Huguenots, and some of the natives sided with the Spaniards in their successful repulsion of the Huguenot frigates. It is difficult to say precisely why the Timucuans, who formerly rallied around Saturigua, now proved unwilling to join the French and Guale in destroying St. Augustine. As historian John Hand pointed out, violent Spanish retaliation for previous offenses, the removal of Saturigua and Takatacuro as leaders. Takatacuro was executed in 1569 and Saturigua fades from the historical record. And long-standing Timucuan-Guale hostilities probably all played a role. All right, so this is very deep what's going on here. Yet Governor Menendez Marquez's depiction of an entirely subjugated Timucuan population near St. Augustine failed to capture the reality. There were evidently divisions among the Timucuans, even in the near vicinity of St. Augustine. On June 6, 1586, Francis Drake, we already know, Sephardic Jew, arrived at St. Augustine after committing devastating raids at Santo Domingo and Cartagena, confronted by 42 ships and 2,500 Englishmen. Menendez Marquez and his 80 soldiers gamely defended their fort for a few hours, but as he explained to Philip II, As soon as the English came down upon the fort, the Indians began to burn the town, right? So-called English, remember, a lot of those so-called English are also crypto Jews, crypto Muslims, Protestants, Catholics, it's all mixed, all right? Not all of the Indians welcomed the English attackers, though. Drake allegedly tried to solicit one village near the fort, but found the village abandoned, its residents having fled to the woods. These friendly Indians were supposedly protecting 200 Spanish non-combatants, all right? They were protecting who? Some Catholic non-combatant people, 200. The Indians were protecting them. But Menendez Marquez apparently placed little faith in their loyalty. The friendly Indians came down upon a certain estate at a distance from the fort where the women and children had taken refuge, wrote a Spaniard, in view of which, and finding himself surrounded by the enemy and Indians, Pedro Menendez Marquez withdrew and abandoned the fort. Once again, the sources failed to specify exactly which Timucuans joined the English destruction of St. Augustine, and which abstained, let alone why. But some Timucuans who had been unwilling to join the proposed alliance with the Huguenots 6 years previously eagerly joined Drake. Perhaps they were convinced by an overwhelmingly superior English force, or perhaps they preferred the absence of Guale auxiliaries, all right? Guale auxiliaries, where collaboration was required in the borderlands. Quick, decisive strikes like those of Gorges and Drake proved far easier to accomplish than sustained partnerships. We know almost nothing about Drake's interactions with the Timucuans, but Gorges and Saturiwa had a relatively straightforward and manageable, if mistrustful, relationship. Both the Frenchman and the Timucuan, right, or the Huguenots and the Timucuan, opposed the Catholic Wautina alliance, so they found it relatively easy to work together for a brief period of time. Gorges' predecessor, Laudonnière, had found it far more difficult to turn the intra-Timucuan rivalries to his own ends over the long term. Similarly, Saturiwa had been unable to persuade Laudonnière to take action against his enemies, and may have had difficulty holding together a pan-Timucuan opposition to the Spanish-Wautina alliance. Adding to this tension, frequent ruptures in borderland partnerships provided continual opportunities for new, short-term collaborations. When the falling out between Wautina and Laudonnière forced the French into fighting against Saturiwa's old rival, the Paracusi, took full advantage of the rift for the short time the French remained in Florida. Similarly, the Spaniards found that the Saturiwa-Wautina rivalry made it easier to cooperate with Wautina when relations were at their worst with Saturiwa. This may also explain why the Spaniards or the Catholics felt they could turn to Wautina when they faced a combined Huguenot-Saturiwa attack. Evaluating the impact of these relationships from the Timucuan perspective presents numerous challenges. The hostility of the Spaniards' immediate neighbor, Saturiwa, probably limited the ability of the former to acquire information about interactions among the Timucuans. We therefore know less than we would like about how the participation in the Huguenot, Protestant, or Catholic conflict affected them. Additionally, Spanish interests spanned an enormous geography, and during this period they generally prioritized their interactions with the Guale and the Calusa rather than the Timucuans, okay? All right? When at the end of the 16th century, the Spaniards began to establish missions among the Timucuans, thereby bringing them into greater familiarity, they found that the Wautina, Potano, and Saturiwa polities, as well as their webs of alliances, had altered significantly. Saturiwa's heirs had lost their preeminence to Takatakuru. Wautina's subordinates had begun to peel away, and Potano's chiefdom had largely collapsed, its main village destroyed. The presence of European soldiers, missionaries, livestock, and microbes doubtless wreaked significant, often catastrophic changes, all right? This is what they did. And the overall Timucuan population seems to have declined after the arrival of the Europeans in the 16th century. Again, this is mostly black folks. We're talking about Sephardic Jews, crypto Jews, even these Catholics, these Spanish, a lot of them are conversos, new Christians. So the Timucuan population declined when these people arrived in the 16th century. But the temptation to attribute this change solely to European intervention should be avoided, as such an interpretation rests on an implicit premise of a static pre-contact equilibrium. Quite to the contrary, the Timucuans lived in an inherently dynamic and volatile political world, and European intervention had the potential to accelerate or retard pre-existing changes as much as initiate new ones. Furthermore, an overemphasis on the transformative role of the Franco-Spanish clash threatens to efface the reciprocity of relationships between Europeans and Timucuans, between these black Europeans and Timucuans. Saturigua demanded that Laudonnière show himself a friend of his friends and an enemy of his enemies, and indeed, it was those intra-Indian political dynamics that drove Timucuans not merely to adapt or resist European incursions, but rather to actively pursue partnership with would-be colonists. All right, guys, and that's the end of the article. All right, it was a long read. Hey, thank you for sticking around and hearing me read. I hope you guys found it interesting. The different perspective of history, get specific details about specific peoples and tribes and what they're dealing with, how they're negotiating, who they got beef with, who they're allying with. You know, what at the end, so where's the Timucuans today? Well, you're still here, And again, this was Entangled Borderlands, Huguenots and Catholics, so Protestants and Catholics, right? And Timucuans in the 16th century Florida. Yeah, and let's not forget, we were talking about Saturigua, and this is the picture from the previous videos, right? Where we learned that statue is representing Saturigua and Moctezuma, right? An allegorical version of them too. A little bit more history of the French Huguenots' involvement here in the United States. Again, French Huguenots are Moors, right? These people would be classified as free whites, according to the Black's Law Dictionary, for the word free white. They never told us history like this. It's interesting because, these people had to survive, so they used each other and, Indian tribes had war and with other chiefs from their own tribes, right? You guys need to understand that. And they took advantage of these beefs when they got here. Hope you guys enjoyed this article. I certainly like reading it. So that was a little history of Florida here. Everything we read today was before the 1600s, right? There's a whole history here with the French and Spanish before the so-called English came and Jamestown and all that. You need to know that. Very heavy presence here. And a lot of these people were left behind. And they, again, amalgamated, assimilated with indigenous peoples. But like they say in Jamaica, right? Out of many, one people. All right? Out of many, one people. All right, shout out to the real ones out there. Thanks for tuning in. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Wow.